Thank you all very much. We've got to stop meeting like this. I need to tell you the sort of the backstory of how this talk came to be. As she mentioned, or in retirement, I still coordinate the astro-themed tours for Sky and Telescope. And one of the ones that we do is we take a group to Italy, and it's called In the Footsteps of Galileo. So we go to all the places where he lived or worked. They're horrible places to visit, you know, Florence, Venice, Pisa, Rome. Somebody's got to do it. And so that will come up here. But I led that tour about 3 years ago, and I needed to prep everybody for what they would see. And so that's what the bones of this talk. Okay, so let's set the stage. There was a time when everybody believed the Earth was the center of the universe. And it was promulgated by a couple of influential Greek philosophers, which was used to describe the people who thought about the natural world. And Aristotle, in particular, conceived of 4 levels of the universe. There was earth, water, air, and fire, in that order, and then the stars and planets up beyond that. And this was a sort of divinely inspired ordering of everything that exists. And so it caught on very well with Christian philosophers of the time, a little bit later. But Earth was the center of the universe. And Earth was, in the minds of many, a perfect creation. You know, for a lot of the Greeks, you can think of all the trigonometry that you learned in school. The circle is the perfect shape, and so that really caught on. Sorry for those of you online, I'm coughing. Interestingly, there was one Greek philosopher in the 3rd century, I guess it counts as the 3rd century BC, Aristarchus of Samos, who was very clever, and you know, it's not widely recognized, but in those days, it was commonly known that Earth is a sphere, not flat. There were multiple ways of knowing that, like there was always, during a lunar eclipse, the Earth always cast a curved shadow on the moon. There's the famous experiment with 2 people in Egypt measuring, you know, at midday, one had cast no shadow and the other cast a shadow. So they roughly coordinated to determine the rough circumference of the Earth. So it was commonly known that Earth was a sphere. And so Aristarchus was very clever in using lunar eclipses to estimate the size of not only of the Earth, but the moon and the sun. And he concluded that the sun was much bigger than the Earth. And so logically, since the sun was much bigger, it probably had more influence. Gravity hadn't been conceived yet as a concept or a physical science. And so because the sun was the largest, it therefore was the logical center of the universe, not the Earth. And so he came up with a matter of explaining the natural world in which the Earth as a sphere rotated once per day and caused everything to move around it, and that it circled the sun once per year, because the annual cycle of seasons was well known, you know, solstices, equinoxes, that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, most of his writings were lost, and what we know about Aristarchus is only sort of piecemeal these days. And so even though he basically got it all right, but then everyone forgot about him until the time of Claudius Ptolemy, who, you know, Ptolemy gets a lot of bad press because he came up with this notion that Earth was in fact the center of the universe. And these are the different levels you can see here For those watching via Zoom, every one of those circles, one's for the moon, Mercury, Venus, and then up near the top is Primus Mobile, which is the primary, there's the celestial sphere to which all of the stars are attached. And so he took that model of Aristarchus with Earth at the center, and he basically became the publicist for it and became widely promulgated. Now, Ptolemy gets a bad rap for having done that, but we owe him a debt because he collected a lot of the knowledge about astronomy that was in those days generated mostly, if not almost completely, by Arabic sky watchers and scholars. You know that many of the star names that we have today are inherited from Arabic and often badly bastardized in the translation process. And also the framework of constellations we know today came to us largely from Ptolemy, who cataloged 48 different constellations, most of which he had heard about or found out about from, again, Arabic literature. So, and he was many other things besides an astronomer, but this was his scheme, and it held sway for a long time. Now, one of the things that Ptolemy came up with was a way to describe the motions of the planets around the Earth, which aren't always steady. And any of those of you who know something about the planets outside the Earth, for example, Mars, it doesn't always behave in one direction. There comes a point during each cycle of Mars around its orbit that it kind of stops, reverses direction, and then continues, and then reverses direction again and continues moving eastward in the sky. And Ptolemy solved that problem. He was trying to keep everything with circles, the perfect geometric shape. And so he came up with this circles on circles concept called epicycles and deferents that tended to explain everything. So everything in the universe circled the Earth in circular orbits, and you know, to explain these odd motions of the planets that weren't always dependably steady, he created circles on circles for just about everything. And so when he did that, so this is, for example, a real sequence of images of Mars against a starry background during 2018, and this retrograde loop that I just described. Let me see if I can paint a picture for how this works. Well, this will actually, I think there's an animation here. Right. This was Ptolemy's explanation for how that happens by having the circle on the circle. And all right, here's what I want you to imagine. Imagine you're running around a track at school. And the track is circular for simplicity's sake. And somebody else is running around the track too, and you pass them on the inside, okay? And you're paying attention to what's behind that person that you're passing in the distance. Initially, you're both moving, you know, that reference point is both moving ahead. But as you pass, that reference point moves backward until you both get around the corner, and then it starts moving forward again. That's sort of the essence of retrograde motion. And so that held sway for 1400 years. Ptolemy's note the structure of the universe, Earth-centered, everything with perfect circles. This was a time when, by that point, you know, God would not have created an imperfect universe. And so circles made complete sense from the church's point of view, Catholic Church's point of view. And the moon, just as a little aside, the moon was the perfect crystalline sphere. And whatever modeled features that you see on the moon during a full moon were thought to be reflections of the Earth. And so the dark areas came to be called seas. And that's why today we still have sea of tranquility and ocean of storms. Those are holdovers from the time at which people who observed thought that they were seeing a reflection of the earth when they looked at a full moon. All right, well, 1400 years later, along comes this upstart, a very smart guy, Nicholas Copernicus was. He was polymath, obtained a doctorate in canon law, mathematician, astronomer, physician, classic scholar, translator, governor, diplomat, economist, and he made a great set of enchiladas too. Anyway, he had started working at a cathedral and was pondering this issue of the planetary motions. And, Ptolemy's system didn't quite really fit. It never quite fit. And he came up with the notion, beginning in actually the early 1500s, that Earth was not the center of the universe, the sun was the center of the universe, and that the Earth, everything was still in circles. This notion of ellipses hadn't been introduced yet, but it solved the retrograde motion problem for the reasons I just said with the high school thing. And so the notion that the sun was the center of the entire universe, not just our solar system, but it supplanted Earth. And he published this as De Revolutionibus. It's called that for short, because none of us can pronounce Latin correctly, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. He published it in 1543. He was literally almost on his deathbed, because he started working on it decades before, but he was so scared of the repercussions within the church, of which he had some standing, that he just kind of kept it secret. This book actually, besides the solar system, it read it myself, but he talked about things like tides and the way the atmosphere works and things like that. It was a sort of a broad treatise. Well, it was an interesting thought experiment, considered that by everyone. It didn't really take hold. In particular, Tycho Brahe, who was his contemporary, and later, Brahe was famous for having observed the supernova in Cassiopeia, and we now know that that's where it was, Cassiopeia. The year that was 1507. I think that was it. It couldn't have been 1607 because he died in 1601. Anyway, it was widely observed. It was daylight supernova, and he was a keen observer of the night sky. Again, this is a pre-telescopic era. Brahe didn't completely buy what Copernicus was selling. And he said, look, I can meet you halfway. I'll imagine that, and this was, apparently there was a comet that came through and had a motion that was more consistent, circled the sun than circled the earth. And he said, aha, all the planets circle the sun except the earth, and the sun circles the earth. That was his solution. That was his hybrid solution. And so you can see it there. Planets orbit the sun, but the sun orbits the earth. And so it was sort of the best of both worlds. Well, okay. Then that was the framework of the thinking of that time as to the structure of our solar system and the universe more broadly. We still didn't know about stars having different distances. It was thought that all the stars were plastered to one big sphere, the celestial sphere, we still call it. And so that would come later. So meanwhile, our focus shifts to northern Italy. And at that time, now mind you, this is the late 1500s, early 1600s. In Trento, did I say it right, Mario? In Trento? the Catholic Church was reacting to the emergence of the Lutherans in Germany, who were creating their own brand of Christianity that was looser and less scripted than the Catholic Church in Rome was espousing. And so the Pope convened this council that lasted for almost 20 years, Council of Trent, to lay down the law, to redefine what interpretation of the Bible was all about and how you're to obey that. You can see the quote there. No one relying on his own judgment. I'll read this because the script might not be coming through. I hand lettered all of this. I want you to know. No one relying on his own judgment and distorting the sacred scriptures according to his own conceptions shall dare to interpret them. That was the law. This was in reaction. So the church went far to the right in terms of conservatism in reaction to what was going on in Lutheran Europe. And so consequently, the stage was set for conflict, for anyone who would dare talk about the what was in the Bible in ways other than had been interpreted. You know, God created the universe of days and all of that. So meanwhile, oops, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button. Meanwhile, there in Italy, there was a sort of well-connected musician named Vincenzo Galilei, who was well known in the court. In fact, he pioneered, had a role in the pioneering of acoustics as a study. And he gave birth to a son, his oldest son, whom they named Galileo. And Galileo was born. And he became quite the even at a young age. And this is an image painting of him at the age of 35. Galileo also inherited a lot of his father's traits. Galileo was quite a poet, playwright, played a fairly good lute if you coaxed it out of the closet. And but his real calling was in the world of academics, the study of sciences and in fact, although his family, perhaps he was the oldest, and so his family for a moment thought he might become a priest someday. But he was drawn to mathematics and he was very good at it. And so, this is what we think of Galileo in hindsight. He was an observational astronomer, mathematician, engineer, experimenter, inventor, and he was all of those things. But he was also all of those things, right? He was really an intelligent, broadly based individual. He went chasing after all kinds of things. Have you ever had the occasion to think about if you could go back in history and meet any one person, who that person would be, right? This is my person. This is who I would go back to meet. Now, all right, so this is a little background on him. He was born in 1564. He was the oldest of 6, maybe 7 kids. And he himself fathered 3 children with his longtime companion and mistress. They never got married, and she went on to get married and have kids. But anyway, Galileo had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. And the 2 daughters, they're born out of wedlock, right? And so to keep them, that made them basically lousy marriage material if you were born out of wedlock. So to protect them, he put them in a convent at a very young age. They were like 12, 13, 14. And so that sort of protected them from the harassment that they would get for having been born by his problem. It's his problem. One of those 2 daughters, Virginia, who took the name Sora Mary Celeste, was very sharp herself in the convent. There was and frequent letter writing that went on between her and her father, Galileo, and all of her letters to him are preserved, and I'll mention the book at the end. and all of his letters to her are lost. And it's thought that, and they would, have been stored at the convent. And it's thought that during Galileo's trials and tribulations with the Inquisition, that they were burned to like protect the daughters from being persecuted themselves. So this is Southern Europe at that time. And Italy, as we know it today, didn't exist. It was a bunch of individual kingdoms that exerted power and influence. Venice was big time powerful. It controlled a lot of the trade up and down the Adriatic Sea, which is here, right? And they were at the head of it. And so a lot of the commerce, not only from Europe, but also from like the Far East, made its way through Venice before being distributed more widely throughout Europe. So Venice was powerful. The Papal States, which is right here, I know you can't see this, but right here, there's a large area of what is now central Italy, that was controlled by the Vatican. They owned that land, and it was a large chunk of territory. Well, in that time, there was a lot of conflict between. They didn't get along, these different states. This is what Venice might have looked like in 1609. A lot of the features that we associate with Venice today were already there at that time. It was a rich and powerful center, controlled by the Medici family, and they will play a role in Galileo's future. Now, this was a time, this is the early 1600s, the New World had been discovered, and people were crossing the oceans on a regular basis, and there was a lot of competition for the riches of the New World, that is the Americas. And so there was a lot of interest in developing ways of getting ships back and forth across the sea. You maybe have heard the story of the development of the chronometer, but there were other things, compasses that preceded that, astrolabes and maps and so forth. Galileo, in his youth, wanted to capitalize on that. He saw this, he was very smart, and he developed a marine compass that he sold, and he made money doing this. He didn't do it because for the goodness, out of the goodness of his heart. He did it to make money. So this was one of his early inventions. Now, very early on, he went to the University of Pisa with the idea of getting a medical degree, and switched to mathematics. He became chair of the mathematics department at Pisa University without having graduated first. Apparently, he was quite adept at math, but he very soon got a better offer in Padua, or Padua as we say, where he taught a number of things. He was always going back and forth to the highest bidder. He was. So it was about this time that a lot of the discoveries involving the very first telescopes were made. And there is we maybe all learned that Galileo invented the telescope and he made all these discoveries. And thank goodness Galileo came along, because we might not have just sometimes not true. In fact, Galileo almost certainly did. We know he did not invent the telescope. And how early the telescope was invented is a matter of debate. But here's a quote about this guy, Thomas Digges, who lived in the 1500s, that he had developed an instrument, it's written, to see any small thing a great distance from you, it requireth the aid of two glasses. And I'm not talking about these glasses, I'm talking about these glasses. And so we don't have any record of what he actually meant by that, but we do know that up in Amsterdam in 1608, an optician named Hans Lippershey had, either he or maybe it's thought that maybe one of his assistants stumbled upon these are the people who made the lenses for glasses, for spectacles. And in playing with them, he suddenly found that he got two right type in a sequence like this, he could cause things to be magnified. And so consequently, this was a big deal. And the word of the spread through Europe. Now, here's your Telescopes 101. our eyes are actually very small telescopes, and they focus an image of the greater world on our retina. And telescopes do the same thing. But what the telescope does is, telescope does two things. It, first of all, gathers more light than your eye alone can gather. The aperture, right, is, even of a simple telescope, gathers 100 times more light than your eye can. And the more light you gather, the fainter you can see, and generally the fainter you can see, the more distant the object. But it also magnifies that view. And so if you ever get, you've all done this before. I mean, I know all the guys have probably fried ants with a magnifying glass. I'm not sure about the women here, but you can focus the sun's light to a spot, and that's where it comes to focus. That magnifying glass has a focal length associated with it. And the same is true of telescopes. And so what Galileo, and Lippershey too, but what Galileo realized is that if you take a convex lens, it takes parallel rays of light and brings them to a focus. Think magnifying glass, that's a convex lens. And then he used a concave lens to basically straighten out the curvature, what's the word I'm looking for? The convergence of all of those light rays and make them parallel again. So when you look at them from where this is, now suddenly you have a virtual image which is magnified over what you would ordinarily see. And it's interesting, interesting little aside here, and you'll see this later. Galileo used these two very different lenses, and a Galilean telescope delivers, it's a refractor, it's a refracting telescope that delivers a right side up image, unlike most other refractors that you might have encountered. But it had a very small field of view. It fell to Kepler not very many years later to come up with a better system involving convex lenses of different focal lengths to deliver a wider view that was much easier to use. But Galileo used his system, and what made Galileo's telescopes superior was he had better quality lenses. The kinds of stuff that Lippershey and other opticians were making were pretty crude, right? Sort of slapped out as fast as they can. Galileo worked himself to like optimize the surfaces and make sure that they were shaped just right. And consequently, his instruments gave a sharper image than those of his contemporaries. What he called it is a matter of debate. He is variously calling it canocchiale, which means basically it translates as spyglass, or an instrumento, or perspicillum. He had all, but the point is he was grinding his own lenses and making his own telescopes. And that's where the genius came in, because it was, this is the front end. The glass was still imperfect, so the lens was, you know, as big as that white area that you see there, and he had to stop it down to get the sweet spot of the lens. The same reason that when you have a hard time seeing something, you squint, right? And that means that you're sort of covering part of your pupil, and it sharpens the image on your retina. It's the same process when you squint. But as I mentioned, it had a very small field of view, and so it's amazing what he accomplished with such a limited instrument. Even so, he knew what he had, and he was going to try to monetize it and capitalize it. He showed it to anybody who he could entertain into looking the Doges in Venice, which was where he was at the time, saying the power of my canocchiale to show distant objects clearly as if they were near should give us an inestimable advantage in any military action, land or sea. So he saw this as a weapon, as an advanced technology for warfare. And he sold it as such. And he wasn't going to give it away. He wanted to sell these things to the highest bidder. Well, continuing, at sea we shall be able to spot their flags 2 hours before they can see us. Similarly, on land, it should be possible from elevated positions to observe the enemy camps and their fortification. Part of his problem was these people that were looking through it could see that things were being magnified, and he thought they thought that he was doing magic somehow, that he was somehow faking the magnified images that they were seeing through the telescope. And so he had to fight those sort of headwinds. Now, I suspect that over his creative lifetime, Galileo must have made dozens, if not hundreds, of telescopes, and yet only two exist today. And they are both in a museum called the Galileo Museum in Florence, and that's those two telescopes. One of them magnifies 14 times, the other 21 times. We know that he quickly progressed from making magnifications from 3 to 8 to 20 to 30 times. And so that those of you who use telescopes know that you need lots of magnification to see stuff, to see stuff with any kind of detail. And so Galileo also came to the realization of the relationship between the focal length of the main lens, what we call the objective, and the focal length of the eyepiece, which is somewhat shorter. And that ratio of those two focal lengths gives you the magnification of the telescope. And he recognized that early on. So he was able to sort of tune in, dial up the magnification he wanted by using lenses of different focal lengths. Flow over flee, as I told my students. So the stage was set for some remarkable discoveries. And at the time, Galileo was living in Padua. He was teaching at the university there, and he had rented a house, and the location of that house is known. That's the address. They've renamed the street, obviously, and that's the place. This is the house here, right? And that's the garden that he used. He set up when he first got these things. We know that, again, that Galileo didn't invent the telescope, but he was one of the first to turn it up to the heavens to make his discoveries. Now, this is like, for astronomers, this is sacred ground. And so when I made this trip with a group back in 2022, we knew where it was. We banged on the door. Nobody answered. We said, well, let's go around the back and have a look at the garden. We couldn't. There was a big wall and all kinds of fences and stuff. And we were very disappointed. There was the wall that hid the garden in which all of these early discoveries were made. We ran another tour just this past year, back in April, and I was determined to get my group inside to stand in that place where the moons of Jupiter were discovered from which. And so I said, well, I've got nothing to lose. This is early AI. Who lives at Via Galileo 17 in Padua? And I got a reply from a Google search. It was like a medical assistant, and it gave, he belonged to this does belong to this organization, and his membership card came up with his name, the address, his phone number, and his email address. And I contacted him and I said, can we come visit? He says, sure, come visit anytime. So the group that went this past April got inside, and this is the guy, Ettore Gasparetto is the guy I made contact with. Scylla was our tour guide. Rick Feinberg, some of you know, he's former editor of Sky and Telescope. He was leading the tour, and he's the one who let us in. It's kind of overgrown now, but Rick is in the process of presenting him with a little thank you gift. We packed something small, but a big bang for the buck, a piece of lunar, which was very well received. Anyway, we finally got in and got to see that place. And so what did Galileo discover? Lots of things. Some you know about, maybe some you don't know about. First of all, he turned it on the moon, the obvious first object to look at. But we now think, and he made all these revolutions like it's not the perfect crystalline sphere that had been advertised. In fact, it was pretty lumpy and bumpy, and he saw detail along the terminator and so forth. That's a series of his sketches. And but it turns out that Galileo probably wasn't the first one to use a telescope on the moon. That honor seems to go to this guy, Thomas Harriot, who made a sketch for this. The date is July 26th, 1609. That's roughly half a year before Galileo started doing it. The problem is his stuff didn't get published. So no one knew, this is Europe. It wasn't like everyone was swapping emails, it took time. And one thing about Italy, if you think about it geographically, the whole northern border, that's the Alps. You didn't exactly cross over frequently. But Harriot probably gets credit for the first sketches of the moon, though he had an inferior telescope, so his sketches were pretty crude. Probably the discovery that Galileo is most famous for was realizing that Jupiter is encircled by a series of 4 moons that are bright enough to be revealed even in a small telescope. Those of you who have good binoculars, Jupiter was rising tonight as we drove in, right? And if you have a pair of good binoculars that maybe magnify 10 times, when you get home, if you're not freezing to death, take your binoculars and hold them against a tree or a wall to steady them, and you point at Jupiter, and you can not only see the Jupiter disk, but some of the little moons just with your binoculars. It's very easy and very satisfying to do. So what Galileo realized, he's watching Jupiter with this telescope, and he realized that this little family of stars was on this side, then they were on this side, then they were on both sides, and he kept very careful records of that, as you can see here. Made over 8 weeks, a period from December through January of 1610, made all these sketches. And this is what you're seeing there on the left is the parts that are moving. That's an anim. The lower parts are the various sketches that Galileo made at certain times. We know what the dates and times are. And the top is a computer animation of where those 4 moons were, and they match wonderfully accurately. So there was no question that he had discovered what we now call the Galilean satellites. Galileo himself wanted to call them the Medicean satellites to honor the family that was bankrolling him at the time. But maybe Galileo wasn't the first one to see those satellites. There is another guy named Simon Marius who also was looking at Jupiter with a telescope and purportedly saw them on January 8th, just about the same time that Galileo did, within a day or so. The problem with Marius is, we just had an article about this in the Sky and Telescope a couple of months ago. He didn't publish his observations. And when he did, it was in some local almanac that didn't really have wide distribution. Galileo, when he pulled together his first observations, he went straight to the printer with it. And that's why he published first, right? So these are those 4 moons. And Galileo called them the Medicean stars and kind of didn't differentiate, but it was Marius who named them. And so there's a tremendous irony that those moons today have the names that Marius gave them, but we know them as the Galilean satellites. And there's just no justice. Anyway, here's a part of that story that you don't know and will be amazed. As Galileo was studying those moons, this is now in December. So what you see here is one sketch. The dashed line here that extends to the lower left actually continues here in the lower right corner of this sketch. And he has right there a star, 2 stars that he noticed and plotted. And this number here, 29, that's the distance in Jupiter diameters in that direction that these stars were, except one of them wasn't a star. Beyond the fixed star A, which is over there on the far left. Followed in the same straight line, this is B, which was also observed on the preceding night, but then they seem farther apart from one another. That is, the two stars were different in separation. That's because one of those stars was the planet Neptune. More than 100, almost 200 years, more than 200 years before Neptune was actually discovered. And so that is a plot of where Galileo thought he saw it versus when it actually, where it actually would be. It was published in Nature. That's a simulation of where Neptune would have been on that particular night when he was observing it. So he saw Neptune, and the thing is, he saw it only on those 2 nights, and maybe it was cloudy and he didn't really follow it up. Because if he had followed it up, because he was a very sharp guy, he would have noticed that something was odd with this moving star, and he probably would have made an annotation about it, but it kind of got lost until present day. He also observed Saturn. He was never really able to resolve the rings as such. As I say, he thought it was a planet with ears, and it fell to Cassini, a contemporary, to actually discover the ring nature of what was going on around Saturn. The star Saturn is not a single star, but is a composite of 3, which almost touch each other, never change or move relative to each other, which is also true. And so, but those sort of the top level things that we recognize Galileo for. But here's some of the other things he did. He drew star fields. I mean, he realized that this is the belt of Orion here, a sketch of the belt of Orion, which includes the Orion Nebula down there, and he's got a close-up of the Orion Nebula. He sketched the Pleiades. He sketched, this is the Orion Nebula region that we know today to be like that. And he also sketched the Milky Way. And he resolved the Milky Way into myriad stars. And it's not smoke, it's actually a star field. And he started observing the sun. Now, it is commonly stated that he stared at the sun and he went blind doing so. That's not true. That's not true. He did a lot of solar studies, but remember, you can project the sun onto a piece of paper and sketch the sunspots that you see. We don't know exactly how he made these observations, but it's possible to use a telescope like at sunset to safely view the sun. He did have eye problems late in life, but it was cataracts and macular degeneration, we think. But the point is, he took all of these early observations and he raced to the printer. He called it the starry, it's sometimes translated, this Sidereus Nuncius, as the starry messenger, but it's more precisely the starry message. And this was now just like a couple of months after seeing the moons of Jupiter. And it was the first published results of observations made through a telescope, and it had tons of drawings in it, and it made him famous overnight. And so suddenly he was really into everybody's thinking. He had in there, he described, first of all, the astronomical telescope, structure of the moon's surface, all the stars he could not see with the naked eye, the nature of the Milky Way, existence of nebula. I mean, what a laundry list of discoveries that he made. And finally, he says that this evidence, now this is 1609, well after Copernicus has died, that the moons of Jupiter going around Jupiter, right? Not everything goes around the Earth. The notion that God made the universe to everything go around the Earth was shattered by the existence of moons around Jupiter. So that really changed the status quo, and it started to give really a lot of credence to the Copernican system versus the Ptolemaic system. This is what I was just saying about Jupiter and its moons. Earth is nothing special. Yes, Earth has 1 moon, but Jupiter's got 4, you know? And so during this period of time, Galileo was peddling his influence. He gave telescopes to the Doges in Venice, and he got a huge raise and lifetime tenure for doing that. and all these discoveries. And the interesting thing is, like, he would take the telescope and he would show these influencers, these leaders, the moons of Jupiter, and they continued to think that it was some sort of hoax, that he was somehow not, that this wasn't real. And so by 1613, he had come out squarely in favor of a sun-centered universe. But if you think about it, if you're trying to convince somebody that the sun is the center of the universe, it's a tough sell. You're saying the Earth is racing around the sun and that the Earth is spinning to create day and night. Well, if the Earth is spinning so fast, how come we don't have this constant wind in our hair as we go, in constant motion? If we're going around the sun, the positions of the stars should change, what we would call today parallax. And they do, but they just didn't realize how very far away the stars are, that the parallax basically couldn't be measured in those days. And the circular orbits for planets was still problematic, and it would fall to Kepler to sort that out. We'll get to that in a second. So there were all of these problems, and Galileo seemed to have an answer for everything. The thing you got to know about Galileo, he was an argumentative SOB, right? He felt he was always right, and if somebody criticized him, he would lash out. Doesn't sound like anybody I know in modern day. Anyway, so interestingly, he thought that he had a flawed notion of the tides. This is like this spinning Earth, and he thought that was due to our Earth's orbital motion. That was one of two things that he got really wrong. So again, I was talking about his personality. He was sarcastic, self-confident, but conversely, he was a devout Catholic, and so he didn't want to run afoul of the church, and so he was treading a thin line. So by this point, being the acerbic guy that he was starting to make some enemies in Florence, in particular, and they started saying, "Hey, this Galileo guy, he's saying things that don't fit the Bible. If he's such a devout Catholic, why is he saying that, the Earth is going around the sun? Clearly in the Bible, Joshua commanded the sun to stop in the middle of the sky, and he could only do that if the sun were going around the Earth," and so on and so forth. And so he was starting to build some critics. And so some of these critics got the ear of Vatican officials and said, hey, this guy is talking about stuff that's, remember the Council of Trent, right? Where the church decided to lay down the law. This was running counter to the notion that only religious people, religious officials, can appropriately and correctly interpret the Bible. So the case was brought against him. And by this time, Copernicus, the theory of Copernicus is being talked about a lot. And the church came down hard and said, Copernicus was wrong. He was, excuse me, this guy, Cardinal Bellarmine, that he demanded that Galileo forsake all of that stuff. Now, back in those days, we're talking about Inquisition time. There were 3 levels of punishment, and the third was the one you didn't want to get. So in this initial engagement, shall we say, with Catholic officials, he got the easiest punishment. It was just kind of a slap on the wrist. And yet Bellarmine, who brought these charges against him, would remain friendly with Galileo, and allowing him, there was weasel wording. Galileo could not endorse the Copernican system, but he was allowed to discuss terms as an abstract kind of argument. Well, Bellarmino ended up becoming Pope. And so this is the sanction against Copernicus. The doctrine attributed to Copernicus that the Earth moves around the sun and that the sun is stationary at the center of the world and does not move from east to west is contrary to the Holy Scriptures and therefore cannot be defended or held. That was the censure. So Galileo got off easy. Now, at that time, the Jesuit order was concentrated in Rome, and they were sort of scientists, and as they remain today, right? So the religious folks who run the Vatican Observatory are Jesuits. This is sort of in their DNA. And in 1618, that we should be so lucky, 3 bright comets were discovered in that 1 year. And a Jesuit astronomer published a discussion about that, and he claimed that those comets were far beyond the Earth, which they were, right? Galileo, in one of the things that he blew and got very incorrect, believed that they were atmospheric phenomena. And so he came out with guns blazing to contradict this Jesuit. He wrote a book called The Assayer. It was kind of like a scientific manifesto. And this book, he took no prisoners, and he alienated a lot of the Jesuits who had kind of befriended him. But interestingly, it was in that book that Galileo published, that book, that Galileo published his first series of drawings of Venus. Those came not right away, but later. And Venus is interesting because it really does cement the argument for the Copernican system. Because if Ptolemy was right, and if Venus was circling the Earth or somewhere, is on one of these different epicycle things, you would never see a full Venus. Because Venus was always, we knew that Venus never was far from the sun in the sky, but if it had this sort of situation, you would never see the entire globe of Venus. But in fact, Galileo had done that. He had seen Venus at all of its phases, and therefore proved that Venus must circle the sun, not the Earth. And so this was in his Assayer. Well, he made a lot of enemies with that book, a lot of enemies. And so, meanwhile, Barberini becomes a pope, Pope Urban the VIII, and they had many conversations between them, and they seemed to be on friendly terms. And Bellarmino was cognizant of Galileo being on thin ice, and he says, look, you can write about the Copernican system as long as you keep it hypothetical. And so what Galileo did was his great book called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief Worlds was the outcome. He figured he had a green light to publish another book about, maybe Copernicus had something going. And the cast was Salvati, Simplicio, and Sagredo. Sagredo was the narrator. Salvati was the learned one, and Simplicio was a simpleton. That's the name. And although it was ostensibly just a neutral debate, it was very clear that Salvati had the superior knowledge, and it was Salvati in the book who talks about the Copernican system. And so it was printed in 1631, and it ends with some Simplicio says some things that are just stupid. And so even though Galileo had been addressing issues that Pope Urban VIII had asked him to do, by putting these words and making such a skewed argument, it was clear what Galileo really thought. And so this is where he got really in trouble. And if you think about it, if you think about all the observations that he has made, none of them absolutely conclusively proved the Copernican theory. They were evidence in support of it, but they weren't ironclad proof. And so basically, can you know something based on experimental science? How can you challenge the reality that God has designed simply by observing the universe? These are the kinds of arguments And I mentioned in passing the tides. He in dialogue, in the dialogue between these, this conversation going on, they talked on and on about the tides and the source of the tides. And Galileo got the tides completely wrong. Even though it was known that the tides were caused or in sync with the moon's phases, he thought that it was really about Earth's rotation, the water sloshing back and forth as the Earth spins. He got that completely wrong. So anyway, as a result of the publication of this dialogue, the Pope got really unhappy, very unhappy. And the Pope had the power to bring people to justice. And so in the meantime, it was realized that Galileo had run afoul of the church back in 1616. This folder that had been filed away with his earlier slap on the wrist warning was unearthed, and suddenly there was a paper trail. And so Galileo was condemned in 1633, vehemently suspected of heresy. He wasn't convicted of heresy, which would have meant death, burning at the stake. He was guilty of really, really suspicious acts of heresy, which was weasel wording that allowed him to escape with his life. But he should have been in prison, but by then his health was failing, and he convinced the church to allow him to remain under house arrest. In the meantime, the book, The Dialogue, is banned. Past and future, they're forbidden. All mention of the Copernican theory is out the window. And so it's rumored that during this second appearance before the Inquisition, he had to basically recant in public all the things that he had said were true. That the moons of Jupiter don't go around Jupiter, that the Earth doesn't rotate, that all of the things that he had found were wrong. And it's said that he, as an aside, after he's convicted, he says, and yet it moves, meaning the Earth moves. There's no evidence that he actually said that or wrote it down or anything like that. And it may be something that was made up in the 1800s, long after Galileo died. Okay, so Galileo's under house arrest, and meanwhile, he is exiled to a place which you can visit today. This is what had been his final home in Arcetri, and in fact, he died. By this point, his son Vincenzo was living with him. He died not far from the convent where his two daughters still were all this time. And in fact, they were close enough that Virginia, the older, smarter, would mend his sheets and send him little cakes that she had made and stuff. So there was correspondence going on between them. He died at age 77 in this home, which again, you can go visit. And the interesting thing is, by this point, almost completely blind, he wrote a real massive treatise that became the foundation of modern observational physics. By this point, he had done a lot of work with the mechanics of moving objects, balls rolling down inclines and timing them. You've surely heard about him dropping the two balls from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. That probably didn't really happen, but it made for good promotional copy. And what's impressive about Galileo is that no one had bothered to experiment with this stuff up until his time. The Greek philosophers never did experiments. They just kind of imagined the world and how it would be, and they made sort of self-consistent theories about things. Galileo actually went out and observed all this stuff. For example, in Pisa, and you can visit it today, everyone knows the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? That's called a campanile, that's the bell tower for a nearby cathedral that you can also go visit. And inside that cathedral is this massive chandelier hanging from the ceiling. And when Galileo was a student there, he would see this thing swinging back and forth gently. And it was a pendulum. And he realized that the period of the pendulum depended on the length of the whatever was suspending it. And that became the basis for something that he never made himself in his lifetime, but he drew sketches of what would be a pendulum clock, which had not been invented yet. And so he had discovered that pendulum motion and made sketches about it. And it wasn't until after his death that his son made a model of a pendulum. This is the pendulum down here at the lower right, and the escape mechanism that would ultimately power a clock. Any of you who have a pendulum, grandfather clock or something like that in your house, this is how it works. And so, his son Vincenzo made a model of it, but died before he could patent it. And it fell to Christian Huygens to actually make the first true pendulum clock and essentially get credit for that. So Galileo dies, and his legacy, this is from his book, The Assayer, which he starts to lay out the philosophy of observational science. I'll read this. Philosophy is written in this grand book, which stands continually open before our eyes, but cannot be understood without first learning to comprehend the language and know the characters as it is written, the language of science, the language of mathematics. It's written in mathematical language, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometric figures, without which it's impossible to humanly understand a word. Without these is wandering in a dark labyrinth. And so this is all the stuff that he did in his lifetime. The geometry, all kinds of engineering, principles of relativity, motions, pendulums, hydrostatic balance, military compasses, all those things. And of course, along the way, he became the father of observational astronomy, something that we all aspire to do today still. We thrill at seeing something in a telescope that we haven't seen before. Well, when Galileo died, he was still on the outs with the church. And so he was forced to be buried in a very small, you see it right here, a small chamber in the church near his home in Florence. And because he didn't want to run afoul of Pope Urban VIII, who was still in power at that time when he died. But later, after Urban VIII had died, Galileo's followers, and he still had legion followers even after his death, took him out and made a proper crypt for him, which you can go see there. Very elaborate, befitting such an important personage, not only in the church, of course, but in the history of science. When they unearthed him from the small crypt off to the side and reburied him, that was the time, well, at that time, they discovered two sets of remains. And the other set of remains was his very loyal daughter, Maria Celeste, Virginia, originally, with whom he had corresponded and been so close to all those years. And so they're both buried in that crypt. 350 years later, Pope John Paul II acknowledges that the church had messed up and that Galileo was right, and he was that any condemnation was removed, and led them to unduly to transpose in the realm of doctrine of the faith, a question which in fact pertained to scientific investigation, not a misinterpretation of the Bible. And so today Galileo has been exonerated. At the time they moved him from one crypt to the other, they took a couple of souvenirs. They broke off a couple of fingers, which are on display in the museum. I think there's a lock of his hair there too. It's just like, what? but it's there and you can go see it. And also I want to recommend to you, there are many books that have been written about Galileo, but probably the most entertaining you can hope to read is this one by Deva Sobel on, this is the letters. So Deva actually learned Italian so she could translate these letters in the original. She examined them all and wrote a book based upon the correspondence as it followed through Galileo's life. So, as seen through the eyes of a loving daughter, it's a great book. I highly recommend it. There were 124 letters. And with that, I thank you very much for coming tonight.
Yes, Michael. I get the first question.
Okay.
Early in the presentation, it looked like a sales call by Galileo showing off the telescope to someone richly dressed. The story, as I've heard it, is that he had to rest his telescope on a windowsill. But there was a lovely tripod in evidence there. Did he have a tripod? Did he design a tripod? Is there a Galilean tripod?
I don't know of one. And so you raise a good point. I have not seen anything to suggest how Galileo steadied his telescope. As you can appreciate, he could easily have just propped it up on a wall or something as he's looking through it. That would be a little bit difficult for him to then like lean over and make sketches by candlelight or however he did it. There are in the museum, there are pieces of what we would consider a mount. So I think you're probably right that he fashioned some way to hold the telescope in place while he was looking, if for no other reason to allow somebody else to see what he was seeing, right? So that's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. It's pure speculation on my part, but I was very convincing, wasn't I? In that speculation. I will try to find out. That's a great question.
All right, thank you. In the room? Any questions in the room? What about online? Oh, can you unshare?
Oh, can I unshare? Yes. It looks like Patty is talking. Irene is talking. No.
Yeah, hi. I have a question. Several years ago, there was a moving exhibit of Galileo's inventions. Did anybody get to see that? I saw it on the west coast of Florida. I don't know if it moved up to. It was incredible. Somebody had gone by his blueprints and all, and actually constructed all these machines he supposedly invented. It's fascinating.
I'm not aware of that exhibit. I try not to go to Florida, despite Mario's treaties that hadn't come down.
Well, I'm pretty sure it went across the country, but I don't know where else it went.
Yeah, I will try to track that down and figure out where that exhibit and whether. I do have this vague recollection that the original telescopes, the ones that are in the museum, did do a tour. They were actually put on display in places other than Florence, and that might have been part of it too. I'll see if I can check that out for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things about being a journalist, right, is you have to be, and Bill, you know this, right? You have to be unafraid to say, I don't know the answer. I don't know, and be willing to find out, or wildly speculate, but as long as you label it as such. Anyway, that's a great point. I don't know the answer. I will try to find out and get back to you through Michael.
Howdy.
Hello. When you were talking about your visit to Galileo's home and garden and what have you, you brought your host a small gift, and your voice cut out just for that second when you said what it was. What did you bring your host?
You're right. Well, I'm sorry it cut out. It was Mario's wife Joyce had made a nice brujol, and no, I'm kidding. It was a piece of meteorite from the moon.
Oh, wow.
We now know that there are hundreds of meteorites that are here on the Earth that were blasted off the surface of the moon and have made it to the surface. Also Mars, by the way. And so it was, and in fact, in the early days, none of us in this room could afford to have a piece of lunar meteorite. But so many have now been found that they're very affordable. For a couple of $100, you can get a small piece of meteorite that is from the moon. And so that's exactly what we did. We bought a meteorite. It was obviously very easy to transport, and it definitely had the wow factor that we had anticipated when presented.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, the moon rock at the Smithsonian is as the consistency of a McDonald's French fry from all the fingers.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Kelly, did Galileo ever record observations of Mars and Mercury?
I'm not aware of any. Remember that he would have had the same challenges that we do observing Mars and Mercury. You need a lot of magnification, and you need also large apertures to be able to resolve the objects. If all you're working with is like a 1 or 2 inch aperture that's been stopped down to minimize the spherical aberration and chromatic aberration, you don't have much chance of seeing Mars as anything but an indistinguishable small reddish disk. So I'm not aware that he ever made those kinds of observations. Even Saturn, right, was kind of at the limit of what he could do. I mentioned that he had a telescope of 30 power, and I'm not aware that he had ever made any with more magnification than that. A rule of thumb for observing Saturn is you can't really make out the rings as such, anything less than 50 power. So I'm not seeing anything about Mars. He surely would have tried, you know, because the planets, by the way, is an ancient Greek word meaning to wander. The planets were known to be special and you know, circling something, and so I would imagine he would have tried and just if he wrote about them saying, I tried to observe Mars and didn't see anything, I'm not aware of it. That doesn't mean he didn't, but I'm just not aware of it. Yes?
Yeah, I just want to, you mentioned how he started off in medicine years and do that. But then when he taught in Kaplan, he taught basically mathematics, physics, medical students,
Right.
firmly establishing connection.
There you go. A tradition that is carried on, right?
What was that?
So Mario was observing that Galileo started off as a medical student, but then switched to astronomy, therefore establishing the universal linkage between appendectomies and catadioptric telescopes. Okay. Yes.
The question of heliocentric universe was under debate for hundreds of years. What do you think is the most significant question that will be answered in the next couple of years?
All right. For those who couldn't hear, her question is, since the heliocentric universe was the big question in Galileo's time, what do I think the biggest question is right now? That might be answered within the next couple of years. Fair? Or longer. I think it will be, what the hell is dark energy? We have, so for those who are not sure what I'm talking about, we know that all of the matter that we see in the visible universe, all the gas, all the stars, all the dust, is only about 4% of the mass of the universe. The rest of it is dark matter, something we have no idea. We know that it has, it must be some kind of mass because it attracts things, you know. But in trying to determine how fast the universe is expanding, this was a major task for the Hubble Space Telescope, was to determine the rate at which the universe is expanding, how fast it's expanding, and that in turn would tell us how old the universe is. We wind everything back to the Big Bang. What was it? And they do this by observing very, very distant supernovas. And there's a kind of supernova called Type 1a, which involves actually a pair of stars, and they always explode with basically the same amount of brightness. It's kind of a standard explosion, if you will. And so as you see these things at ever farther distances and see how faint or bright they are, you can tell how far away they are with some certainty. Still with me? Okay. You can also tell, based on how much the wavelengths of light are stretched out, how fast it's moving away from you. So the thought was that had been, that if you think about the Big Bang and have everything like exploding out into space, that it should be slowing down. Maybe not enough to ever come back together, but slowing down. And what they discovered instead is that it's speeding up. The acceleration of the universe in this time frame right now, anyway, is speeding up, contrary to everything you might imagine. Now, Einstein actually explored this question. He called it the cosmological constant in his time, because he couldn't realize how could it be that the static universe, because that's what we thought at that time, that everything was still holding place, why it didn't all come back together. And Einstein imagined this constant that was actually kind of an anti-gravity. But when we realized that the universe is expanding, Galileo said, oh, I was wrong, there's really no cosmological constant, but he was really right again. And so we now are faced with this conundrum that the universe is expanding by something akin to anti-gravity that is pushing stuff farther away. And we may have a handle. There are many experiments, ongoing observational experiments now, to try to understand the nature of this expansion and maybe get our arms around why it is happening and what's causing it to happen. So that's my big question for the night for you. And I hope you all don't lose sleep over it. Okay?
All right, one more question.
I see two hands.
They're applauding.
Oh, they're applauding. Well, that's two hands, right? Go ahead.
One last question. There was somebody who was a near contemporary of Galileo who posed a multiplicity of worlds.
Oh, yes, Giordano Bruno.
Thank you. And there was some relationship between him and Galileo. He met a very bad end.
Yeah, I don't. Bruno, right? In the years before Galileo, famously, well, he was kind of heretical anyway. Said a lot of things that didn't sit well with the church. But one of them was that he famously said that there must be an infinite number of suns, and which are surrounded by an infinite number of planets which are inhabited. That there must be life elsewhere. And of course, the Bible says that life was only created here on the earth. Actually, the Bible doesn't say life was only created here on earth. It is, as we say, moot on the question of whether God created life elsewhere. And so, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, he was burned at the stake. Giordano Bruno was. For that and other, crimes against the church. And I don't think they overlapped. Bruno, I think, was in the early to mid 1500s, and if I'm sorry.
I think it's in 1518. Reached the idea of
1518.
Yeah, 1518.
1580, 80. Yeah. So Galileo would have been alive then, but they were sort of like a generation or so apart. I don't think they had any sort of correspondence with each other. Though Bruno, by that time, the Copernican revolution had begun. It was out there that somebody has thought about the sun being the center. But Bruno took it way farther than that. And of course, he was right. But
did Galileo know about him and his?
I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, thousands of people died as a result of the Inquisition.
Yes.
I don't think there was a list anywhere. It's a fair question. I don't know.
The Inquisition. Nice last question, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Nobody expects the Inquisition.
That's
I was
virtual
gonna say
Colossians.
I guess there's food and drink.
There's still food and drink, not for you guys, but for
Thank you
us.
so much.
Thank you all for tuning in.
I got my own pie.
Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Happy holidays.
Thank you very much, Michael, as always. I always enjoy these.
Have a great holiday.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Thanks for showing the room.
See you next month.
Hi, Irene. Oh.